Welcome everybody. It's really fun just to see your names and know we're in, some kind of same space together. We've been really missing being out with, big groups of volunteers, and this is a nice way to get together. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Audrey Stewart. I'm the volunteer coordinator for Austin Water's Wildland Conservation Division. Welcome to the first webinar in the Balcones Canyonlands Preserve's Forest Restoration Training Series. We'll be hosting 7 webinars as part of the series on Monday evenings through January. So the next 2 coming up, we have registration open. Those are going to be about woody plants with some information about learning woody plant ID and other things to know about woody plants in the landscape, and another webinar about planting trees. So Jaya is going to post the registration links for those in the chat. We'll be posting kind of links in the chat as we go. Hopefully you can see the chat, and if you have any questions, let me know. So we have a really amazing community of volunteers. A lot of you know that. Volunteers restore ecosystems, they survey endangered and rare critters and plants, lead guided hikes, and do much, much more. So thanks to all of our volunteers who are here today, and also welcome to any new folks. So I'd like to do a quick poll, because we got a lot of folks here, and that is just to see how many of you are already just volunteers and how many of you we're welcoming for the first time. So I'm gonna do a poll. We're also pretty excited about our new polling abilities. So.
Oh, wow.
So I launched a poll. We're just gonna take a couple seconds to do this. I see answers rolling in if you volunteered on the Balcones Canyonlands Preserve. And so that might be on the Vireo Preserve with Jim and Lisa. It might be at Wild Basin, our partners with St. Edwards or Travis County.
Yeah. I don't think we can actually.
No.
So it's looking like about 60%. So a little more than half have volunteered on the Balcones Canyonlands Preserve before, and then about 40%, so like 24 folks are new. So
that's great too.
Awesome. It's great to have everybody here. I'll go ahead and end the polling. It was fun for me. Thanks for me. So we'd love to have everybody out, to hike and volunteer with us. Right now we're suspending our guided hikes until next year. We'll, share more about that once we know more. But we're happy to announce that we'll be able to bring back our regular volunteer work days on the Balcones Canyonlands Preserve and water quality protection lands later this month, with a maximum of 10 folks and some extra safety precautions to make sure we're all staying safe. So if you want to receive an email notice when that happens, I'll be sending out an email to our e-newsletter subscribers. So Jai is going to post a link to sign up for our e-newsletter if you don't get that yet. And that'll be your way to kind of get a notice that we have posted those events, and you can start signing up and flexing all of your new forest restoration skills. So at the end of the presentation, I'm going to also share we'll be sharing like follow-up resources after each of these. And so for this one, we'll be sharing Lisa's paper based on her talk that's related to her talk today, and a video about ash juniper. And then also we'll be sharing a recording of all of these webinars, including this one, on our YouTube channel. And Jai is going to post a link to that YouTube channel so you can have that and bookmark it for visiting all these again. And a couple of Zoom items before I turn it over to Jim O'Donnell to introduce the BCP and the series. I'll MC a Q&A session at the end with Lisa and Jim, so we'll save all our questions for the end. But you can at any time type your questions into the Q&A feature. It looks like 2 little speech bubbles and says Q&A. And I'll be going through those and kind of be asking Jim and Lisa questions at the end. Another thing for the presentation, if you're new to Zoom, on the upper right side of your screen, there's an option to go speaker view instead of gallery view. I recommend that for the presentation. It'll make it nice and big. So now I'm going to introduce our first speaker, Jim O'Donnell, a biologist with the City of Austin. So Balcones Canyonlands Preserve. For over 30 years, Jim has combined his love of teaching, biology, and environmental stewardship to help protect the black-capped vireo and endangered golden cheek warbler in Central Texas. He taught science and environmental education in Dripping Springs for 28 years. During that time, he was instrumental in setting aside the 214-acre tract of land that is now known and very loved as the Vireo Preserve, which once supported the largest concentration of black-capped vireos in Travis County. As a result of his efforts and knowledge of the endangered songbirds and their ecosystems, Jim was appointed to the Biological Advisory Team that provided the basis and support for the Balcones Canyonlands Preserve, a system of preserves established under a Federal Endangered Species Act permit to protect multiple endangered and rare species in Travis County. After retiring from teaching in 2009, Jim has spent the last 11 years designing and implementing habitat restoration on the Vireo Preserve, which is now owned and managed by the City of Austin as part of the Balcones Canyonlands Preserve. Jim uses his knowledge of the species, plants, permaculture, and teaching to implement regenerative habitat restoration projects with a community of volunteers to benefit a variety of native Texas hill country ecosystems. He regularly gives presentations to numerous state and local groups and was a presenter in the 2019 Global Earth Repair Conference in Port Townsend, Washington on this topic. And this will be his first Zoom presentation. So thank you for being here and getting adventurous with us. Take it away.
Well, welcome and thank you. This is quite a treat. We had originally intended to do this in person at the Vireo Preserve, and due to the virus, we are adapting to come up with a new alternative here. And this is actually working out great because I think the most I could have had at the Vireo Preserve is 15 people. So the fact that we've had over 100 people register is a real plus for us. So let's go ahead and get started. The Balcones Canyonland Preserve System. The Balcones Canyonland Preserve has been identified as a biodiversity hotspot with many endemic and imperiled species, including cave and spring invertebrates, and the endangered golden cheek warbler, which nests only in the juniper oak woodlands and forests of central Texas. The governing document for the BCP is called the Balcones Canyonland Conservation Plan. And it was one of the first multi-species habitat conservation plans in the nation under Section 10 of the Endangered Species Act. It provides a streamlined approach to Endangered Species Act compliance, and it allows take of habitat and requires replacement of acres protected within the BCP. It's a 30-year permit and it was issued in 1996. The permit holders are the City of Austin and Travis County, and in that permit, it requires that 30,428 acres in western Travis County must be protected and managed as an endangered species habitat. At least 2,000 acres must be managed to protect existing and create additional black-capped vireo habitat. And the remaining 28,428 acres must be managed and protected and protect existing and restore additional golden cheek warbler habitat, which is one of the things that we're working on with restoration work. This is a map of the BCP, and it's color-coded depending on who is actually managing the properties. The City of Austin actually owns and manages 13,608 acres. It may have gone up a little bit since that, but you can see we have a number of partners, including LCRA, the Nature Conservancy, Travis Audubon Society, and Travis County also has a BCP. They're a fellow permit holder, and they have their own acreage that they manage. In 1996, when the permit was issued, you can see in green here the BCP, and this is the preserved land that was set aside. And in yellow, you see the development in 1996. By 2006, you can see the development was really increasing around all of our boundaries of the preserve system. And in 2016, you can see that we're pretty much surrounded by development. So the BCP is something we can be really proud of. This is something that you know, that the community of Austin, it was a kind of a grassroots effort working with a number of stakeholders to kind of come up with a way in which development could happen, and we knew it was going to happen in western Travis County, but also preserving land for endangered species. The endangered species that we protect, well, the golden cheek warbler, The black-capped vireo is just recently delisted. It was an endangered species. And we protect 6 karst cave invertebrates. And we have species of concern that we're monitoring, like 25 different karst species and 2 plant species that we actively plant quite a bit of these days. We also protect 62 cave features, karst features across the BCP. We actually do restoration work around these karst and cave species. So we do surface planting. The surface and the subsurface of these features are connected. For example, we have a volunteer here who is planting just above a karst feature that you see down on the right-hand side there. And the benefit of planting is that it helps to control erosion and it reduces soil moisture loss when you have plants in the system. We also plant a lot of native pulpy fruit-type trees and shrubs, which provide vital nutrients for foraging cave crickets as they come out in the evening. And the cave crickets eat on this fruit and then return those nutrients back into the system. We also have teams that clean caves out. Caves were used as dumping grounds from the 1800s all the way up to not too far in the past. And a lot of sediment ended up in caves. So we clean out these caves to improve water flow. Our major goals here, the BCP restoration goals, as we look across the BCP at different types of habitat, the BCP is blessed with some beautiful prime habitat. It's this gorgeous stuff to walk in, but not all of it's prime habitat. So we spend time protecting prime habitat, enhancing systems that are recovering. We have recovering systems, and we do have degraded areas that we are actively restoring. So part of what we do in restoration work and working with volunteers across the BCP is identifying the ecosystem's condition and how do we help it out. The first picture here on the left is prime habitat. This is where golden cheek warblers are going to be found, and this soil is incredible. It's full of fungi, it's moist, it holds moisture. These trees are older, some of them a couple of 100 years old in some of our prime habitat spots. We don't have to do a lot of work in these areas. We do monitor them for problems, and maybe there's some erosion. We have hog issues in some of them that we monitor and deal with, but that's not an area that we spend a whole lot of time on. The next two, the middle one here is enhancing and habitat. So this area, there's a little bit more sunlight hitting the ground. It's in transition. The soil is moving towards a more fungal-based soil structure. And when we go into these areas, we typically add a lot of diversity back into this system. We both seed and plant. And then on the third area, really degraded habitat, the first thing that jumps out here is sheet erosion. You can see how water runs across that landscape, and it is declining. If left unchecked and there's no work done on it, we're eventually going to have head cuts coming across that and really degrade even farther. So the first thing we would look at there is some type of earthwork to control the flow of water, and then we can start adding plants and soils and things like that to kind of rebuild that system. We would never want to leave the system bare like this. This is compacted soil, so we need to get plants regenerating that soil. This is a picture on the Vireo Preserve of a degraded site. It has been degraded for quite some time. If you look closely there, you can see a lot of compacted soil. We have a few grasses that are kind of holding on there, mostly grama type grasses. The area is just not doing well. So we went ahead in October of 2019, about a year ago, and decided to do some earthwork here to change the system. So if you look at it here in April of 2020, you can see that we did some berms and swales. We had a contractor, a very talented contractor, who dug us these swales, and they're about 7 feet across. The berms are about 8 feet across. We used the soil that came out of the swales to plant in, and then we start enhancing the soil in between. adding lots of diversity, lots of seeding to try to rebuild that soil structure. You can see there in the spring with all the wildflowers, things doing well. And in September, after one of our rains, and by the way, this water soaks in within hours and it soaks right into the berm. And this is literally thousands of gallons of water slowly pluming down the hillside here. Chance of regenerating some of our springs down below. And this site here is above an endangered species habitat, an old growth endangered species habitat, and it's benefiting from this system. And this was done by lots of volunteer help. And so it's earthworks, it's learning, tree planting and all the stuff we're going to be talking about in our series. And this is a picture just the other day in between the berms and swales, and life is sort of returning in all of its diversity back into the system. It's a wonderful thing to walk through here early in the morning with all the birds spreading seeds, and in the afternoon, the butterflies going across this. It's really changed. So the thing to remember, and if you're thinking about volunteering, is that restoration, the thing to remember about restoration work is that you're working and learning in a community of wonderful volunteers. And Aldo Leopold said it best, probably with a smile on his face, that acts of creation are ordinarily reserved for gods and poets, but humbler folk may circumvent this restriction if they know how. To plant a tree, one need be neither god nor poet, one need only a shovel. And sometimes a pick and a rock bar for those of you who have helped me dig out there. But on the berms, we actually got 80 trees planted in a few hours because the soil was so nice there. Building a community. So the idea behind restoration work on the BCP is we need a community of helpers. We need people who are well trained. So the goal of this series is to share best practices and build a community of trained volunteers who will join us on the BCP to enhance and restore functional ecosystems from the ground up. So as I said, we've got over 30,000 acres set aside. Some of it is wonderful habitat, not all of it is. So the community is set aside the BCP. Now we're asking, see if we can get the community to kind of rebuild some of our sites that need restoration. This is one of the projects that is a popular project. We take something like, it's an invasive species, ligustrum. It's harvested off the BCP, and instead of piling it up and making a fire hazard out of it, we inoculate these logs with turkey tail mycelium. And the turkey tail spreads through and eats up all the sugars, and there's the mushroom turkey tail there. And it eventually breaks these logs down to, you can pick them up and actually crumble them up into a mulch. So it's taking something that's kind of a problem species for it and turning it into mulch. And the mushrooms themselves on the right-hand side there are medicinal. They're great for the immune system, which is a good mushroom for this time period. Also, these logs, once they're kind of eaten out a little bit and hollowed out, they become wonderful sponges. So we'll use them in erosion control and have them kind of stacked up, and they hold moisture, and then we'll plant in between them. Oak seedlings are great in that environment. And this is a group last fall of tree planters. They're still smiling after a couple of hours of planting trees. And I think we probably got in, maybe 15 trees that day. It's hard digging out there. So everybody, it basically plants a tree. So what we're asking you to do is to join us in a community restoration, skill development, and team building for projects across the BCP. And we have a series of classes that we're going to do, every couple of weeks. Today we're doing Lisa's Historical Ecology talk, which will be talking about the history of the hill country. And then we'll be talking next time about woody plants and placement and structure and where we put them, why we plant them there, their function in the environment. And we have some tree planting techniques that we're going to be teaching along with acorn. Lisa's going to be talking about her study with oak regeneration. We're going to be talking about non-native trees in November, December 7th. I'm real excited about this one. This is rehydration of the landscape. We have, in some of our places, we have very compacted soil when And if it rains, if we get a 3 or 4 inch rainfall, it sounds good, but if it all just runs off, it doesn't do the landscape any good. So we need to rehydrate our landscape. Soil biology and geology coming in January. And then our last one, we'll have a guest speaker who's talking about mushrooms and restoration. So with that, I'll turn it over to Lisa, and be just a second while she brings up her presentation.
Thank you, Jim. While Lisa's bringing up her presentation, I'm going to go ahead and give you a little background on Lisa too. So Lisa O'Donnell is the senior biologist for the City of Austin's Balcones Canyonlands Preserve. Lisa's lived in Austin, Texas most of her life and embarked on a career as an endangered species biologist in 1987. She began working for the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service in 1991, soon after the listing of the golden cheek warbler. Hearing frequent claims that the hill country was originally dominated by grasslands, Lisa began researching the issue and has been compiling historic accounts and other documents ever since. Her presentation on the ecological history of the Texas hill country is the product of over 25 years of research. Today, as senior biologist for the Balcones Canyonlands Preserve, she's a proponent of combining historical research and ecology to making informed land management decisions, including protection of the golden cheek warbler, black-capped vireo, karst invertebrates, aquatic salamanders, and rare plants that occur within the preserve.
All right, so thank you, Audrey. So I've put together a presentation that combines two of my favorite subjects, ecology and history, and lets us do a little bit of time traveling. So we'll go back as far as the written records are available, which are the early 1700s, to get an idea of what the predominant vegetation communities were in the hill country prior to European settlement, and how they've changed and how our perceptions have changed over the past 300 years. So we'll also talk about the relevance of historical ecology to present day land management and why that's important for restoration. So I started compiling historic accounts for the hill country a little over 25 years ago. I was working for the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service during the early 1990s, right after the listing of the golden cheek warbler as endangered. And it was during this time that I started hearing things like the hill country was originally dominated by grasslands that became invaded by woodlands due to overgrazing and fire suppression, that Native Americans burned on a regular basis, and that ash juniper is not native and was brought in by the Spaniards. So just as an example, the image on the slide is from a mural on a building outside of Kerrville that says, quote, area Indians annually burn the divide grasslands to provide fresh graze for antelope and buffalo. And since there's no citation, I just wanted to see if I could find support for this and then also for the other claims. So here's another example of how prevalent the belief is that the hill country was originally grassland. This article from 1985 uses historic accounts to justify land clearing practices. And they're pretty drastic. You see a big old chain and some fire, and particularly targeting ash juniper. And so the quote on this slide, again, this is from the 1985 article, says, present day patterns of vegetation in the Texas hill country have shifted from rolling hills clothed with tall grasses. One of the most striking differences in the landscape is the large area that is now covered with dense cedar breaks, extensive stands of tall shrubs and trees dominated by ash juniper, commonly known as cedar. And I'll just say ash juniper and cedar will be used interchangeably throughout this presentation, but ash juniper actually is the correct name. And in addition to the quote that's shown on the slide, this article also states that, quote, when Frederick Law Olmsted crossed the Colorado River in 1857, he described the hill country region of central Texas as a vast region on which the live oak trees stand alone or in picturesque groups near and far upon the green sward, which rolls in long waves. The first settlers found the landscape covered with little timber other than ancient cypress trees and some scattered sturdy oaks growing upon a carpet of lush grasses and herbs. And again, these are based on interpretations of what Olmsted said. So we're going to actually go to the source and see what he said, as well as others, about the hill country vegetation. So today, as a land manager for the Balcones Canyonlands Preserve, I'm particularly interested in historic accounts for the Austin area, since managing habitat for endangered and rare species begins with an understanding of how past events and natural processes have shaped our present-day ecosystems. And these are some of the endangered and rare species on our preserves. Jim showed some of these same pictures. And so we've got the golden-cheeked warbler, the black-capped vireo, cave invertebrates. This is a little pseudoscorpion, aquatic salamanders. It's a photo of the Jollyville Plateau salamander, and rare plants. And the pink flowers with the bee hovering over it, that's the bracted twist flower. And then the one with the white flowers in the lower right is the canyon mock orange. And all of these species, either directly or indirectly, depend on juniper oak ecosystems. So as I mentioned, I started working on this project a little over 25 years ago. And to date, I've compiled accounts from over 20 observers, including missionaries, prospectors, settlers, scientists, and reporters. And the criteria for each of the accounts is that they must be firsthand primary accounts. So letters, diaries, reports, publications, documents that were written by the observers soon after the experience. Memoirs tend to be problematic and less accurate, as are secondhand accounts. So I did my best to exclude those. So my goal for this project is to give voice to the observers and allow them to speak for themselves and to kind of bring them back to life for a little bit. My role is just to provide spatial and temporal context, including where each observer was with respect to major ecological regions, as well as timelines of major historical events, which I've divided into 4 different time periods, which you can see here on the slide. And then during the latter part of the 1800s, other sources of information like historic maps and photos, buildings and land grants become available to corroborate the written accounts. And wherever possible, we want to cross-reference and piece together information from different sources to provide corroboration or validation. Historical ecology is a lot like piecing together a puzzle. Many pieces are necessary and should easily fit together. And it's important to look at multiple accounts and sources of information and looking for common threads and consistency rather than focusing on one single account. And all of the pieces of the puzzle should fit together and make sense. So just a brief mention of historic records. While this is not the focus of my project, I do want to address the myth that ash juniper is not native. Fossilized juniper pollen has been identified in Friesenheim Cave, which is located in northern Bexar County, and the pollen dates back to the last ice age, so about 14,000 to 20,000 years ago. So juniper's been in Central Texas for a pretty long time. So when looking at the written accounts, it's critical to first determine where each observer was with respect to major ecological regions, and particularly the Balcones Fault or the Balcones Escarpment, which separates the prairie region from the hill country. And Austin, San Marcos, New Braunfels, and San Antonio were all settled on the prairie side, which you'll see here in dark green, the Blackland Prairie, near the base of the escarpment. And the respective counties lie along a major ecological divide that includes both the prairie and the Edwards Plateau ecoregions, and those support very different plant and animal communities. And then, yeah, the Balcones Escarpment, if I didn't already say that, is kind of that black and white hatched line. So when Frederick Law Olmsted reports seeing extensive grasslands, we need to know whether he was on the Blackland Prairie side or the Edwards Plateau side of the Balcones Escarpment. And so for this project, we entered the locations of the historic accounts into a GIS database. So I'll show several maps of the location of where these observers were. And before I forget to, the term hill country in this presentation refers to the hilly portions of the Edwards Plateau and a portion of the Llano Uplift, and then a small portion of the cross timbers. So we begin our first time period and timeline of events. And while I've been unable to find any written accounts for the Central Texas area prior to 1700, several significant events occurred that will influence events in the next century. Cabeza de Vaca is shipwrecked off the coast of Galveston and begins the first European exploration of interior Texas. The map shows the approximate route that he traveled through South Texas and on into Mexico. And with the arrival of the Europeans, we have the introduction of livestock, followed by acquisition of the horse by Native Americans. And following acquisition of the horse, the Comanches moved south into Texas and displaced many of the neighboring tribes, including those formerly in the hill country. And while the Comanches were expanding southward, the Spanish were moving to the north and east and establishing a network of missions and presidios. So all of the accounts during this time period are associated with the Spanish expedition. And I've got a couple of examples. So the early Spanish expeditions avoided the hill country and skirted the edge. The major highway during this time was a route between San Antonio and Nacogdoches known as the Camino Real, or the Old San Antonio Road. And that roughly follows what is today Highway 21. And this is the first account that I could find of travel into the hill country beyond the Balcones Escarpment. And the map shows the route for the entire expedition from the Rio Grande up through Nacogdoches. Those are the red lines. And the location of a couple of present-day cities. I put San Antonio and New Braunfels on this map, and Nacogdoches. And this account is starts at present-day New Braunfels and travels up the Guadalupe River. And I'll point out here that all of the accounts of the hill country vegetation are presented in italics throughout the presentation. And then also that this observer talks about traveling a distance of 3 leagues, which is roughly 8 miles. So we'll read this first account from 1719 from Father Celis. We traveled upstream with a desire to ford the Guadalupe River or reach its source. We traveled about 3 leagues, 8 miles, of very rugged land owing to heavy woods and many rocks. And at the end of the 3 leagues, 2 soldiers left for upstream to reconnoiter the land. They said it could not be traveled because it is more wooded and contains more rocks. The woods consist of oaks and junipers. And then the second account is the first recorded European foray across the hill country. The observer traveled as part of an expedition from San Antonio north toward the San Saba region to establish a mission in a presidio. And this is Miranda from 1756. Going past the Balcones Escarpment, we arrived at the river they call Alarcon, or the Guadalupe River. This travel was an effort because of the many hills and rocks, the many arroyos formed by the hills, and some thickets that contain valuable cedar and oak timbers. And Miranda recorded similar observations throughout the entire route, which included the Blanco and Pedernales rivers, and just a couple of other quotes that I pulled out from his journals are, the first is, quote, "In all of this region, there are no commodities nor anything except good cedar and oak timber." And then the second one is, crossing many swollen creeks and thickets of cedar and oak timber, we arrived at the Arroyo de los Pedernales. And I don't know if you can see my cursor, but the Pedernales River is like right here. So our third time period, I divided the 1800s up in half because there's so much happening. So we start with the first half. And we begin the 1800s with 2 wars. We have Mexico's War of Independence from Spain, followed by Texas' War of Independence from Mexico. Houston and Lamar battle over the location of the Texas capital, and Lamar finally wins. And we end the time period with Texas becoming part of the United States. So the following excerpts are examples of written accounts during this time period. So this first account provides a good example of an observer reporting grass as far as the eye can see. And it's critical to note that the observer was describing the Blackland Prairie, and we need to keep reading for his description of the hill country. And again, here's the map, and the route is a red line, and the dot, hopefully you can see that, the dot is roughly where the observer was when he wrote this account. So he's on the Post Oak Savannah, traveling west towards San Antonio, and he's about to enter the Blackland Prairie. So this is Benedict in 1839, and he says, "Immediately before us appeared as an extensive lawn with a beautiful green sward, slightly tinged with the various flowers which decked its surface. Not a shrub or bush obstructed the monotony except the towering live oak." And we have to keep reading. "Further to the west appeared the skirting timber, thickening the further it receded and rising gradually so that mile after mile of the dark boating forest rose to our view." So here we have a couple of descriptions that were written by the founder of New Braunfels in 1845. This is Prince Carl, there's a picture of him. And he's talking about traveling long distance through underbrush and heavy forest that he compares to the Black Forest in Germany. So again, 1845 near New Braunfels, and we'll read this. "On the left bank of Comal Creek, there is well-forested bottomland which extends to the cedar, oak, and elm-covered cliffs, which here already have considerable height. Beyond this, there is a ridge with summits here and there, similar to our Black Forest. From its confluence with the Comal Creek, I, with 4 companions, attempted to reach the head spring. However, having covered only 5 miles after hours of chopping through underbrush and heavy forest, we had to return without success. So here are a couple more descriptions near New Braunfels. These are from Ferdinand Romer. Romer was a German geologist who spent over a year studying the geology of Texas from 1845 to 1846 and wrote extensive accounts of his travels. So Ferdinand Romer, 1849, says the cedars here are not the stunted shrub-like plants found in the northern states of the Union, but are stately trees with straight trunks, seldom more than 20 to 25 feet in height and 1.5 feet thick. They have a uniformly spreading crown. The cedar forest is a treasure to the colonists of New Braunfels, since the wood was preferred above all others on account of its durability when used in building houses and fences. So yeah, just note the size of those trees, 1.5 feet thick. It's pretty big. And saying that the cedar forest was a treasure to the colonists. And this is a photo of an ash juniper tree in New Braunfels that's listed as a champion tree in the National Register of Big Trees. And according to the National Register, it's 41 feet tall and 3.5 feet in diameter. We also have a few, and I'll just say a very few, really large ash junipers, not quite that big. But we do have a few within the Balcones Canyonlands Preserve. These are slow-growing trees and estimated to be several hundred years old. And based on growth measurements or diameter growth measurements on the BCP and the Balcones Canyonlands National Wildlife Refuge, ash juniper diameters grow about 1/2 inch to 1 inch per decade. So it's pretty slow. It takes a long time to get this big. So these observers describe the route between Austin and San Antonio, essentially along what is today the I-35 corridor. And we'll start with Romer in 1849. And he says, the road between New Braunfels and San Antonio led us over an open, undulating prairie of great fertility. And again, they're on the Blackland Prairie, so that makes sense. A cedar-covered slope, similar to that at New Braunfels, was at our right for the first 10 miles, which farther on flattened out into a low-lying chain of hills. And then we have Victor Bracht, also in 1849, who says, the hills which extend all the way from Austin to New Braunfels are covered with heavy timber. So during the mid-1800s, other sources of information become available, including original land grants. So this slide shows the original land grants for Travis County, and they are outlined in gray. And I superimposed an overlay of major ecological regions. So we have the Blackland Prairie, which is the dark green again, and the Edgeworth Plateau, which I say is beige, but other people have told me is light green. So you can pick your color, but it's the lighter color to the west. And field survey notes were usually recorded along with the original land grants and often provide information on the species of trees and their diameters. And we refer to these as witness trees. This information can provide insight as to what the dominant trees were at the time the notes were written. And the field survey notes that are shown here are for William Barton's property near Barton Springs in 1838. And the surveyor reported an elm, hackberry, cedar, Spanish oak, and live oak. So now we come to the end of our last time period with the advent of the industrial age in Texas. We begin this time period with the establishment of Native American reservations and their removal from Texas to Oklahoma. Barbed wire was patented in 1868, which is going to pretty dramatically change our landscape. The first train arrives in Austin in 1871. We have the establishment of national parks, the opening of colleges, completion of the Texas State Capitol, and the discovery of oil. Major cattle drives started up with an estimated 20 million cattle driven from Texas to Kansas between 1866 and 1886. The sheep and goat industry also started about this time. And the population in Texas increased from a little over 200,000 in 1850 to over 3 million by 1900, an increase of over 14 times the 1850 census, with the largest increase occurring after 1870. And by the end of the century, we've lost 2 of the most abundant animal species ever reported on this continent, the passenger pigeon and the American bison. So the following excerpts are examples of written accounts during this time period. So according to this observer, ash juniper was being cut for rail timber as far back as 1855. And just remember that the first train arrived in Austin in 1871. And so that corresponds pretty well. And the route again is red line. The location of the observer is the red circle in what is today Williamson County. And this is Mr. Johnston in 1855. And he says, "We rode from Austin to the Brushy Creek, 20 miles near Cedar Park, and encamped for the night. Our road was for about 14 miles of the way over a rich rolling prairie and for about 6 miles through a heavy cedar brake. Cedar is the main reliance for rail timber in this section, the live oak being too gnarled for such purposes." So just note the reference to 6 miles of heavy cedar brake and then the contrast between its description of the prairie and the hill country. So by the late 1880s, we have maps and photos that we can use to corroborate the written accounts. And just note with the map, the artist's rendition of grass, where we have no texture, versus woodland, which is the textured area in the map. So again, it kind of lines up with the prairie area where the town was settled. And then off to the west, you have the hill country. And the photo was taken from the Capitol Dome right after it was built, around 1888, and it's looking southwest. And so we'll read these accounts. So we have Victor Brockton in 1849 saying, "I have visited Austin for the first time. The surrounding country is quite beautiful. Dark, steep, cedar-covered mountains rise about 5 miles north of the city. The country on Barton Creek presents an extensive range of cedar hills." Oh, this is De Cordova in 1858. "The country on Barton Creek presents an extensive range of cedar hills and is much broken." So now we come to the descriptions of Frederick Law Olmsted that we talked about at the beginning of the presentation. So Olmsted was a travel writer and designer of urban parks, including Central Park in New York City. And so we'll read these. These are Olmsted from 1857. "Beyond San Marcos, which is where he was staying, our road approached closely the hill range, which is made up of spurs coming down from mountains north. They are well wooded with cedar and live oak. Behind us were the continuous wooded heights with a thick screen of cedars, very beautiful prairies." And then if you look at the photo, you see that lines up pretty well with what he was saying. So again, you see the town, which is on the prairie side, and then looking in the background, you can see the wooded hills. So here we combine information from the original land grants and historic accounts. Note that the plot sizes are large on the prairie side, the dark green, compared to those on the Edwards Plateau, and beige or light green, however you see that color. And the descriptions from these observers provide a possible explanation. So the first is De Cordova from 1858. "The wild lands in Travis County may be purchased at very low rates. The cost of improvements is a serious item. But when a cedar fence is once put around a plantation, it will need but little repair for many years. With vast prairies, we have also cedar lands at intervals seldom exceeding 5 miles, and these can be purchased at a small price. The planter finds a cedar lot of indispensable value from the abundant material for improvements with which it furnishes him." And then Mr. Wood in 1861 says, "Our fences are chiefly made of cedar rails from the cedar brake above Austin." And based on the historic accounts, water was abundant, which led to the establishment of the communities, Austin down to San Antonio, along the base of the Balcones Escarpment. And this is just one of many examples. The photo is of Bull Creek. It's below what we call Cat Mountain today and RM 2222, and we're looking north-northwest sometime in the early 1900s. And here we have an observer expressing concern about overgrazing as far back as 1860, overgrazing by sheep. And I'm going to let you guys read that quote, but I paired this one up with this photo, and this is one of my favorite photos, because you look at this area and it kind of looks pretty overgrazed, and then these oaks don't look like they're doing very well. This photo, it took me a long time to figure out where this was. This is 2222 today. And if you know 2222, if you've ever been to the County Line restaurant, that would be kind of back over here. Right around here would be, there's a fire station there today. And again, we're looking west. Bull Creek is back here in the background. Lakewood Drive would be right here. Loop 360 would be in the background. Oh, and we've got the BCP, fortunately for us, somewhere in the background too. And we can look at building materials during this time period as well. We have a few old cabins and barns on and near the Balcones Canyonlands Preserve that were made from large ash juniper trees during the latter part of the 1800s. And this little cabin, there's no sign of it anymore, but you can at least look at it and tell that it was also made out of juniper trees. So the livestock industry expanded on the Edwards Plateau during the 1900s, and the map on this slide shows the concentration of sheep and the sheep and goat industry on the plateau. And the photo is of an Angora goat herd on what is today part of the Balcones Canyonlands Preserve. And I just kind of put all of this together just to be thinking about how this might have affected the vegetation and what we see today. So this is one of my favorite quotes. This is from the Austin Daily Democratic Statesman, which was the precursor to today's Austin American Statesman. And I really like this photo too. This is, if you look right here, you'll see ash juniper, which were used as railroad ties. That's what was used to build the first railroads that came through. So we'll read from the Statesman back from 1874. The cedar tie business has contributed largely to the growth and prosperity of the Hill City, that's Austin, in the last 2 years, more especially the last 12 months. A gentleman connected with the railroad says that, I'm going to emphasize this, 200,000 cedar ties have been shipped from the city during the last 2 years. And when it is remembered that these ties bring from 60 to 90 cents each, the reader will readily comprehend the vastness of the revenue from this source. And this seems like a good one to follow that. This is an account from Henry Atwater expressing concern about habitat for the golden-cheeked warbler as far back as 1892. And he says the golden-cheeked warblers are nowhere abundant and only to be met with in the thickest cedar breaks. And as these are fast being cut and burned out, the bird will no doubt still become still more rare. Sorry about that, I kind of get that one up. So note the photo of the golden-cheeked warbler nest here, which is made out of ash juniper bark, and it's in an ash juniper, and it's just another example of how ash juniper is native. So my project ends with William Bray's publications in 1904. William Bray was a forester and the first botany professor at the University of Texas at Austin. Bray wrote a lengthy report about the timber of the Edwards Plateau and another report about the forest resources of Texas, and both of those were in 1904. And this is where we start to see a shift in perspective about the hill country vegetation, with later reports describing the hill country as grassland being invaded by woodlands. And we get a hint of this from Bray's reports, but it's not quite as full-blown as what we see in later years and what we see today. So we'll read this, oh yeah, and I'll just point out too, this is a waterfall on Bull Creek. So William Bray in 1904 says, the writer knows of no region in which any species of cedar is so uniformly abundant and dominant as is the mountain cedar in the limestone country of Texas. Mountain cedar is the most valuable tree of the semi-arid hill country of Texas. In another excerpt from William Bray, where he attempts to describe the extent of the woodlands, I'll just read this quote too, where he says, the data are not at hand to warrant even an approximate estimate of the area covered by cedar. The Colorado River breaks, one of the largest series, are almost continuous from Austin to the San Saba country. It is perhaps no exaggeration to estimate the area of these alone at 500 square miles. Cedar was so abundant, it supported a whole culture of people dedicated to harvesting it. It was first used to make charcoal, and later for fence posts, railroad ties, telegraph poles, and all kinds of building materials. Cedar clearing was such a big industry that an axe was created specifically for this purpose. And this is a great article from Gene Holland from 1946, so we'll just read this one quote. The cedar eradication program was greatly accelerated as a result of the invention of a new type of axe, especially suited for cutting cedar trees and cedar brush. The cedar axe is a product of the hill country in Texas, where armies of cedar choppers have been swinging away for over 30 years. It was invented partly by accident and partly because of a real need for a better tool to do the job. So just note the reference to armies of cedar choppers. The size and intensity of fires appeared to increase during the mid to late 1800s, and here's just one example. And again, this is William Bray from 1904. And he says that deplorable loss of cedar has taken place from brake fires. For half a century, these have periodically occurred. Areas which have not been burned over are the exception. Every old settler can tell of big fires which burn for days. In July 1901, a very disastrous fire occurred near Marble Falls, in which about 600 acres of valuable cedar were destroyed. And I'm just going to point out here, so this is a juniper, and you can see hatchet marks on here, and then the dark are the old burn scars. So now let's connect history and its relevance to present-day land management and habitat restoration on the Balcones Canyonlands Preserve, and we'll use William Bray's accounts of the West Bank Peninsula in 1904. So I'm going to show you a couple of photographs from William Bray's Timber of the Edwards Plateau report, but first provide orientation for the location of those photos. So this slide shows a topo map of the West Bank Peninsula just west of Austin from about 1895. And again, if you can see my cursor, this is Austin, the town, and we've got Lake Austin, which back then was called Lake McDonald. We've got Bull Creek. We have Mount Bunnell over here. Pennybacker Bridge would be somewhere right here, and Loop 360 would run somewhere like that. And then most importantly, though, we have Wild Basin and the City of Austin's Vireo Preserve, roughly right here. And then here's Lone Tree Hill, where this is where William Bray took the photo, the first photo, where he's standing on top of Lone Tree Hill, looking north into what he calls the North Gorge. And then the second photo, he took south of Lone Tree Hill, looking north into what he calls the South Gorge. So he was standing in the second photo somewhere right about here and looking north, where you can see Lone Tree Hill in the background. So here's William Bray's photo, first photo of the North Gorge, where he describes, which he describes as having an almost impenetrable growth of cedar and mixed timber. And here's William Bray's photo of the South Gorge, which he describes as having been cleared of most of the woody vegetation. So to illustrate the effects of forests on soils and the behavior of runoff and rainfall, Bray compared these two areas. He describes the heavily timbered northern gorge as having a deep, layer of rich soil. In contrast, the southern gorge had been denuded, quote, denuded of soil down to the rock and adobe, and are never covered with more than a scanty growth of drought-enduring plants which do not suffice to hide the white, arid slopes. And during a heavy rainfall, water in the southern gorge would, quote, pour down as from a steep roof and erode every vestige of organic soil. Bray describes the runoff after heavy rainfall in this southern gorge as being very violent. And again, in contrast, in the forested northern gorge, quote from Bray, the downpour broken by the timber covering is shorn of its force and is largely taken up by the porous ground. Thus, the water is prevented from getting head enough to form a flood or to erode the soil, and at the same time is detained so that vastly greater quantities are absorbed by the limestone formation beneath. So in his comparison of these two photos, Bray makes several points. Forest builds soil, forest protects soil from erosion, keeping it cool and moist, and forest soils act as a sponge and promote recharge. And he concludes, quote, for all of these reasons, forests tend to conserve the water supply and to maintain full springs and an even flow of streams. And William Bray believed that the woodlands of the Edwards Plateau were critical to protecting the water supplies downstream and advocated for their protection. And so we have a very different perspective today. So along with the changing landscapes, our perceptions of how the landscape should look has also changed. And this is why knowing the history is really important for making land management decisions, because if you grow up with this as your frame of reference and you're a land manager, you're probably going to manage more like this. And if this is your frame of reference and you grew up like this, and it's been like this for a long time, you grew up like this and your grandparents saw it, then you're probably going to be more inclined to manage that way. And so having that history is really important. And here's a photo of the Vireo Preserve in Wild Basin today. This is just south of Lone Tree Hill. and looks kind of similar to what William Bray described in that second photo. And this shows an example of eroded slopes with sparse vegetation over subsoil, which we call caliche, and bedrock. And we've lost most of the topsoil on these slopes. And without the benefit of William Bray's descriptions and photos, we might just think, well, this is how the vegetation's always looked. And based on aerial photos, we know this area was clear again in the 1950s, or clear cut actually. And then from written accounts, we know that there was a large fire in 1961. And even with that historical evidence, I've still been asked whether the clearings on these slopes is a natural phenomenon. So now let's talk about looking for evidence of past events on the landscape. And fortunately for us, ash juniper makes this job pretty easy. Its wood breaks down very slowly, so where it's been left in place, it can last a really long time. And these are just a couple of photos of many juniper stumps that we can still see on these mostly bare slopes. And because the slopes are steep and the soil washes off really quickly, it's very hard for woody plants to get reestablished. And so we talked about hatchet marks. That's what you see here. And then hatchet marks here, and here you also have a burn scar. And I don't know if you can tell, this is a really, really steep slope. And then some of these old junipers are really big. I measured some that were close to 2 feet in diameter, which is pretty big, especially considering how long it's been probably since they were cleared, and they were probably even bigger when they were actually cut. And unfortunately, we've lost evidence of the hardwoods and other plants that would have been part of this forest, since those are going to break down really quickly compared to ash juniper. And ash juniper is one of the few native plants that can grow in these harsh environments. And even that is having a hard time right here because the slopes are so steep. And if you look underneath the juniper canopy, you'll see that that's where all the life is. So you can kind of get, again, cursor, you get these little islands of life. You have a variety of woody plants. You can see evergreen sumac here. I've seen silk tassel and persimmon and agarita, and lots of forbs and grasses. And they're all occurring like right here. And then out around it, you kind of get these little deserts, which is mostly bare caliche with some, at best, some really sparse bunch grasses. And then when you look at the soils beneath the canopy of this motte, you can see it's rich in organic matter. So that's the dark brown color compared to the adjacent caliche slope. And this is really important for restoration since plants require soil. And anybody who's been out with Jim to help plant trees and in this caliche stuff will really appreciate the organic matter and this nice dark rich topsoil. So we recently made a video of one of our neighbors, this is Don Gardner, talking about ash junipers on the ranch that his family has owned for over 40 years. And here's he's explaining how the needle cast of juniper trees is helping to build soil, and then how that allows other plants to germinate and grow. And then when those plants start to grow, then they all together are contributing toward that soil building process. And the video is on our Facebook page. It's just, I think Audrey said she's going to give that out too. It's just a little over 3 minutes long if you haven't already seen it. And here's just kind of a nice concluding quote. This is a really good book on historical ecology from Egan and Howell from 2001. A fundamental aspect of ecosystem restoration is learning how to rediscover the past and bring it forward into the present to determine what needs to be restored, why it was lost, and how best to make it live again. And I think Audrey also mentioned the report. I've basically put all of this information and a little bit more into a report. There's also an appendix at the back that includes all of the excerpts that I've been able to find to date. So you're welcome to look through that some more if you want to dive in a little bit deeper. And then I'm always looking for new quotes too. So if you find some really good firsthand accounts of vegetation of the hill country, you can always let me know, or any cool old photos or whatever. I'm always looking for that. And with that, that's it.
Great, thanks so much, Lisa. And thanks, Jim, for the introduction. We have some questions. If people have more questions, you can put them in the Q&A. I see Susie has a hand up. So Susie, I can call on you if you want that hand up, or okay, no hand. Okay, great. So let's start with Bruce's question. So related to the intro about the BCP, Bruce had a question, and Tom had a similar question of what does a 30-year permit mean? So what happens at the end of a 30-year permit when it expires?
Yeah, that's a good question. Yeah, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife issued the 30-year permit, and it will come up for review here in the next few years, and they'll make a determination of whether or not to extend that permit, or I don't know.
Well, it'll definitely be extended. We actually hired a consultant to look at lots of different options for the city of Austin and Travis County. So yeah, we're currently reviewing all of those options, and it can be as simple as you just change the date. And it can also get really, complicated if you want to change the list of species that are covered. So yeah, so those are things that we're currently looking at, but I think we all expect for it to be renewed in some form or fashion. So, and that'll be 2026.
Thanks. And Bruce had another question, which I actually had too, which in that map of the BCP partners in the beginning, what does the unavailable property mean? The areas that were highlighted in red. On the
Yeah,
BCP.
some of those properties were properties we would have liked to acquire because they're kind of missing pieces in the puzzle, so to speak, because you want kind of contiguous landscapes for golden cheek warblers and not to reduce the edge effect. And unavailable means that they were slated for development and we can't get them.
Sorry, I'm muted. Bruce asks, why was the Vireo delisted from the endangered species list?
Go ahead and take that one.
So that was in 2018, and it was basically because the Fish and Wildlife Service determined that their populations were stable and that we had found more black-cap vireos than we knew about when they were originally listed, in a nutshell.
We didn't necessarily agree with the delisting. They had been talking about delisting the black-cap vireo for a while, and we would hope that it would be downgraded if they were going to not delisted, but listed as a threatened species. But they changed the criteria for it, and then it met that criteria, and they delisted it.
So this question is asked, are there any natural, quote, fields in Texas, or should they all be covered with plants and trees? I think maybe field, I'm assuming is like bare, maybe bare ground or rock. This person can kind of correct me by adding another note if I'm getting that wrong.
Yeah, one of our first principles in any type of restoration is to leave no bare ground. And a lot of the stuff that we deal with is subsoil. The topsoil has been washed off, so we're dealing with the caliche mineral base. And leaving anything bare is a bad thing, because the heat in that area is generating heat in the summertime. I've done thermometers and caliche, and in the summertime it can be 120 degrees in that caliche base, and then I'll move it over to where it's a mulched fungal forest, and it'll be 82 degrees. So uncovered ground is a heat island, and it's also an erosion area too. So bare ground is a bad thing, and whether it be in a preserve system or whether it be in agriculture, bare ground you lose vital nutrients, the erosion, wind, that type of stuff is just not a good practice.
Thanks, Jim. Okay, we got some more questions. Great questions rolling in. So Douglas asks, what other hardwoods are mentioned as native in the historical records?
Oh, yeah, William Bray actually has a whole list of them, and I'm trying to remember which report that was, one of his 1904 reports. But yeah, he talks about the different oak species, he talks about cherry, he talks about cypress. Juniper is overwhelmingly the one that I see over and over and over again. It's juniper and live oak that I see a lot of. And then once you get, and I guess something to keep in mind is most of these observers were not botanists. we're fortunate to have a couple of scientists. I mean, Ferdinand Romer being a geologist, you know, and then there were a couple of botanists in there. And then lucky to have William Bray's reports in 1904 because he was as well. So they go into a lot more detail. Lindheimer was another one on the different types of plants. I was thinking, yeah, Lindheimer might as well, but he spent most of his time on the prairie side. Occasionally he would go up into the hills close to his home, but most of his collections come from the prairie side. His little house is still on Comal, and you can go visit it. But yeah, I would have to go back and look at the Bray report just to get that list. But from what I'm remembering, I think those are most of the ones that were fairly commonly seen.
And Daryl asks, notwithstanding the fire set by post-colonization settlers, are there any references of Native Americans setting fire in the hill country?
Oh, that's a great question. So I have not been able to find any. I did finally come across one, Mariah Wade did her dissertation on Native Americans of the Edwards Plateau. And Edwards Plateau is used kind of loosely because it was really the western edge of the Edwards Plateau, and then south, like even off of the Edwards Plateau, more in the brush country. But I did finally find an account, but it was really far west. Oh, I'm blanking out on the name of the towns over there, like the Concho River.
That far out, yeah.
Yeah, like farther west than Brady. What's San Angelo? That's yeah, somewhere like even west of San Angelo, where one of the observers said that they had found an area that had been burned recently for buffalo. And again, the observer's making an assumption that that's what happened. He didn't actually witness it. So, you know, you kind of have to take that a little bit with a grain of salt, but at least I did finally find one account that said that. Everything else, the fires are really small. Like, so when you're reading the accounts of the Spanish expeditions, when they're coming up from the valley and heading over to Nacogdoches, they would talk about stopping and using smoke signals to try to bring Native Americans in, to communicate with them, to bring them in. And that's how they would, you know, bring them in and say, hey, we're lost, or whatever they wanted to talk about with them. And you would think if they had fires going on all the time that, you know, they probably wouldn't just be using smoke signals, because the Native Americans would just be going, oh yeah, there's just like another fire going on. So they were really, really rare. And even in the Spanish expeditions that I've read, you know, that are off of the Edwards Plateau, I very, very rarely came across anything. And it was either smoke signals or it was a way to avoid an attack. Like
constant war, yeah.
Yeah, like somebody's coming into their community, and they would, you know, it's sort of like a smoke screen that they would light a fire, and then they would hide. So, but yeah, not as a management practice within the forested area for sure.
Yeah.
From Kristen, we have, do you know how far to the west the cedar forested areas extended historically? Did they extend out to Johnson City?
So I'd have to look where Johnson City is with respect to all of that. But if you go to the report, I have a map in there that shows golden-cheeked warbler habitat. And I would say it's probably pretty much in line with that.
Okay. And then I have a couple questions that are similar. One is, so I'll say both at the same time. And Amanda says, sometimes I hear ranchers say that juniper drinks up water out of the watersheds. Is this true or a rumor? And then Sarah also says, what do you say to people who call cedar water hogs? She just heard that today.
Oh, okay, sure, yeah. You know, juniper doesn't take up any more water than any other tree. Texas A&M did a study a few years back where they had an oak tree and a juniper tree out on the open, and they found that they both basically took up the same amount of water. But if they're in a forested area, they both take up less water. So it really depends on environmental conditions and a situation like that. But it is one of the things that we have to deal with a lot. People, it's a myth that kind of comes up a lot.
And it's something that the video I mentioned near the end that Don Gardner talks about too. So you can take a look at that as well and his response to that.
Okay, and then another one related to kind of the historical ecology. So Helen asks, are you also making the argument that in fact there wasn't as much prairie or savanna historically in Central Texas as we Central Texas restorationists typically think? Because presumably if there were plentiful prairies, these explorers wouldn't have spent so much time and energy fighting their way to navigate through juniper breaks when they could have just traveled through grassland, unless the cedar was typically adjacent to water sources.
Right, and I think that's, again, you know, you just have to be aware of where you are, because the expeditions tended to go up through the brush country, and then the Blackland Prairie and the post-oak savanna, and then over east. So, and these guys didn't travel lightly. I mean, these were huge caravans. I mean, they had livestock and a ton of people, and you know, so it was a big caravan. So they had to have a lot of space to be able to, you know, spread out and get through these areas. So, and they talk a lot, like in the brush country, they talk about a lot of mesquite and live oak. And then once they get up onto the Blackland Prairie area, you can tell, you know, they talk about mottes of trees, and they would get forested areas along the riparian zones. Interestingly, the post oak savanna, they were always really afraid of that. It was not actually a savanna. It was really, really thick and dense. And they had a couple guys went off hunting one day and got lost for like 2 weeks. So, so that was another forested area in Texas and a little bit farther east. But yeah, it really just depends on where you are. And then when you go out farther west on the Edwards Plateau, once you get beyond the hill country, like maybe, you know, once you get up on top on the tableland, it starts to thin out. And then you get to the high plains, which are, you know, huge areas of grassland and native prairie.
Yeah, and there's a case in Fredericksburg where the Comanches referred to the area where the Germans settled as the burn land. That's, they cleared it and they burned it. And then where the Comanches were, it was still forested. You know, there's kind of a reason why Austin and Bronzeville and San Antonio and all that are located on the edge of the hill country there. And that was kind of the major, you know, transportation route of the day at that time too, because it was just easier to move those big wagons down.
And Elizabeth asks, how can we get the city to list large ash junipers as heritage trees?
Yeah, we should like that, if that would.
That's a really good question.
Yeah.
There is a community tree preservation division that might deal in that.
We are trying to deal with some of the issues with the city on taking juniper off the invasive species list or the problem species list and things like that. So it's kind of been baby steps, but we're getting there. We're working on it.
Yeah, I would say as a heritage tree, that's a really good question, and we should look into that.
You know, the other thing too is not a lot of people have seen some of these really big juniper trees. You know, when they look at juniper trees, they're looking at the little guys trying to come back in really degraded habitat, and that's interfering with their more majestic oak trees, you know. So, you know, one of the great things about the BCP is we have some of those areas that were really majestic junipers, and you walk in there, you know, and it's really quite different than it is in some of the areas that are more degraded.
Speaking about trees that can't get any respect, Alexandria asks, can you speak about the hackberry? I guess.
Yeah, I love hackberries.
Yeah.
You know, a lot of people whack them down all the time, but hackberry tree is another one of those trees that grows fast. You know, the thing is in restoration work, we're looking for stuff that kind of come back, open up that soil, deal with that compaction. And although hackberry wouldn't do great in caliche either, but it's a great little edge forest plant. And if you've noticed all the snout butterflies zipping through the area, they're moving through right now. And the hackberry is their host plant. And so when we have these really dry, hot August like we did, a lot of the predators for snout nose butterflies get killed off. So we have this huge population right now snout butterflies in the area, and they're laying their eggs on the hackberry leaves. So it plays a valuable role. It's the berries themselves are good bird food, and everything plays a role out there. And that's one of the interesting things about restoration is even something like baccharis that a lot of people remove on site. It's a wonderful tree for migrating monarch butterflies. It blooms in the fall here, opens up some of this really compacted soil. And, you know, I can control it by, you know, chopping and dropping a few places here and there. And it helps to build soil and acts as a mold. So you just kind of work with what you have on the site, and you can usually find a good advantage to restore things with.
Great. And yeah, we'll be digging deeper into some other trees and woody plants
Yeah,
next
definitely.
webinar too.
Yeah.
So Derek asked, that's a good segue into using what you got and restoration. Do you bring new soil in when you replant areas, or try to get plant growth in what's left after the degradation?
Yeah. It's so ideally we would not be bringing in new soils. Sometimes we have to because there isn't any topsoil left. And so if I can get to the site with soil, sometimes we'll use soil to bring in. We have to be real careful because of tawny crazy ants. We don't want to introduce anything into these systems that we don't want there. We try to work with what we have, but oftentimes we don't have any topsoil left. It's just caliche. And, you know, using structures, earthwork type things, we can loosen up that soil, build one rock berms, get water soaking into that soil. And we can usually get some plants, grasses sometimes, started in those systems, or using trees that can really, like Mimosa borealis and trees that are going to be able to deal with really compacted, hard, tough soil that don't need a lot of watering, just to kind of get things started. But we do both. Sometimes we do bring in soils and compost to kind of get things started, and sometimes we don't. So.
And related to hackberries, Elizabeth added, wait, Lindheimer hackberry and netley hackberry love our limestone. So not just the sugar hackberry out there.
Yeah.
And then a couple of mushroom questions. So one, Bruce says, which I feel like needs a little bit of liability, like, you know, subtext, but how do you prepare these mushrooms for eating related to the turkey tail? Like when they grow on your logs? Yeah.
You know, I have not done that. I do buy turkey tail. You know, Paul Stamets has this whole thing. You know, you can buy capsules. I usually buy them at Whole Foods or Wheatsville, but but you can do that. I have not done that with the mushrooms that we have. We have harvested the mushrooms for people who want them, though, and but I haven't done that. And I'm not a mushroom expert, and so especially dealing with volunteers and coming from an education background, I'm really cautious about telling somebody to eat something. So, but we're learning on that.
Yeah, and our purpose is really for the ecological restoration, and we're aware of the medicinal benefits, but you know the main purpose is to have it do its work, you know, out on the land.
Right.
And related to that, Jessica asks, we're a little getting short on time, but can you cover the procedure of mushroom inoculation and source of inoculation material that you used for the decomposition project?
Sure.
And maybe also, more on that to come.
We do source it locally when we can. It's turkey tail is a hardy mycelium, and we usually purchase it locally. And we've learned how to grow our own, but it's easy sometimes just to get the local strain that we get. And it comes in a sawdust. It's white mycelium mixed in sawdust. We drill a hole into the log, maybe as many as 10 logs in a diamond shape, or 10 holes in a diamond shape. And we take the mycelium, which is in sawdust, and we pack it into that hole, put a little bit of wax on top just to keep moisture and stuff from insects from eating it and stuff like that. It only takes a week or so before it starts moving through the log. And, it takes about 8 months or so before you start getting mushrooms fruiting off of that log. And within a couple of years, you can pick it up and break it up in your hand. So we try to use the local strain where we can. And it's just a great way to use something, like I say, that's a bit of a problem child for us, and using it for something that's real beneficial.
And we do have a paper on it too, if anybody wants to go into a little bit more detail. Yeah, so about the
Great.
inoculation process.
We're going to finish these last couple of questions, but before we do, I just wanted to ask Jaya if she could post those links to the Dispelling Ash Junipers video that Lisa cited, and also to the paper version of your talk, Lisa.
Oh, great.
And then, so a couple of questions on black-cap vireos. So Ramon asked, how many black-cap vireos are there? And maybe on the preserve, like on the preserve, and then I guess out there in general, maybe?
Yeah. So on the Vireo Preserve in the early 1980s, I had in a 200-acre area, almost 30 territories of black-cap vireos just on the Vireo site. And then by the 1990s, early 1990s, the population in Western Travis County collapsed due to development and isolation of the big mother populations. And so they've sort of been in a recovering state. You know, we're kind of on the eastern edge of their range anyway. So it's really more golden cheek warbler habitat in this area, but we do have black-cap vireos, of course. And so as far as numbers, they seem to be increasing in Western Travis County. I know Travis County has some great black-cap vireo habitat. But I'm thinking maybe there may be 30 males across Western Travis County now in a population versus what we had back in the 80s, just in one small preserve. So they're making a slow comeback. You know, we have them sometimes show up, but then a female doesn't show up. So they're, you know, they'll leave that territory and that kind of thing. But it's a gradual, you know, we'll see what happens in the future here with it. We kind of keep the black-cap vireo habitat out there. One, it's because of permit, but two, we're just sort of keeping the lights on for them. So.
Thanks. And then related, yeah. So Bruce asked, what are the consequences of having the vireo delisted from the endangered species list? Does that allow development in their nesting areas?
Yes.
Yeah, it does outside. Now for the BCP, our permit, we don't treat them any different because we're committed to protecting all of the species on our permit. And the Fish and Wildlife Service delisted based on the assumption that they would continue to be protected at places like Fort Hood and the Refuge, and there are places out farther west and southwest. So that was kind of the deal. Is that they would continue to be protected, and they'll monitor to make sure that they are. But yeah, outside of those areas, yeah, there is no protection for them anymore.
Great, thanks. And Twyla mentioned that the Refuge still protects. That's right, and also the other partners of the BCP.
Yes, yeah, the Nature Conservancy, the military, and yeah, and Fish and Wildlife
the state
are
parks,
all and Parks and Wildlife are all committed.
Great. And then Jessica had one follow-up question about turkey tail. She said, any luck using the turkey tail on Yopon, I guess to
Oh, it would work. Yeah, it would definitely work. Turkey tail's pretty aggressive on stuff, so it's an easy one to use. That's why we use it.
Great. And then Bruce has an easy one, which is just bravo, exclamation point.
Oh, thanks.
Answered live. Thanks,
Yeah.
Bruce.
Yeah.
Well, thank you, everybody. We're wrapping it up. Posted a couple of links. Thanks, Jaya, to that video that's on our Facebook and YouTube, but of neighbor Don Gardner dispelling ash juniper myths, and to dig at the report to dig deeper into Lisa's talk. There's a lot of great information there. So thanks everybody for coming to our first installment. We're excited to share more about restoration and get folks involved when we're out on the lands again together. So thanks again. Really love our volunteers, and so happy to have you here in this, you know, remote space together.
And thank you, Audrey, for doing this.
Oh, great, thanks. And Jim and Lisa, you should read all the comments and stuff in the chat when you get a chance.
Yeah, now I see them.
Great.
All right, well, thanks so much.
Yeah, thank you, everybody.
Yeah, thanks, everybody. Everyone have a good night and take care, and we'll hope to see you again.
Okay, bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.